Hello and welcome to tonight's Future Telling. I'm Gillian King-Cargile. Thank you so much for being here tonight. On behalf of Northern Illinois University's STEM Read and the University Libraries, I'd like to welcome you to this month's Future Telling talk. We would like to thank the Friends of the Library and NIU STEAM for their support. We'd also like to thank the Division of Outreach and Engagement and Regional Development and the Division of Research and Innovation Partnerships for their continuing commitment to community programming. These future telling conversations are at their core about hope. Hope that rational thinking will win out over fear. Hope that science will continue to help us make sense of the world. Hope that by working creatively and collaboratively, we can bring about a brighter future. If you're interested in supporting future telling, go to go.niu.edu/givefuturetelling and make a donation. Tonight's talk is Comets and Craters. According to NASA, the Earth is bombarded with over 100 tons of space dust every day. But from the asteroid that caused the dinosaur apocalypse to the mysterious Tunguska event in Russia, some meteorites have made a huge impact on our planet. As natural resources grow scarce, we also look to the sky for new sources of important elements to harvest or mine. Tonight, we're joined by Benjamin Percy, author of The Ninth Metal, The Darknet, Wolverine, The Long Night, and other works, and by environmental historian Andy Bruno, and also NIU STEAM educator Jeremy Benson to explore how asteroids and meteorites have shaped our past and could reshape our future. So we will get started tonight with Jeremy Benson going over some terms with us to set the stage. Jeremy, why don't you come on in?
There we are. Hello, everyone.
Hello, welcome.
Welcome.
All right, well, thanks for being here with us, Jeremy. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at NIU STEAM and why you like to learn and teach people about space?
Okay, so as Gillian mentioned, I am one of our full-time STEAM educators. So I run a lot of our camps over the summer. I kind of help manage all of that, in addition to going out to schools, doing informal education programs, demonstration programs, setting up hands-on events where kids can come through and interact with different experiments. And I have just always loved discovering and then sharing those discoveries, figuring out how things work, and then helping other people to figure out how those things work.
Awesome. Well, tonight we are talking about comets and meteors and meteorites. So I thought you could go over some of those terms and just make sure everybody's on the same playing field with that.
Sure, yeah, because those are terms that kind of sometimes get mixed up or we're not sure exactly what the differences is. So you mentioned three terms there. We've got meteors, meteorites, meteoroid is another one that we might hear. So let's talk about what each of those means. So we start out with objects floating around in space. These are our meteoroid. No, I got to make sure I have it right. These are our meteoroids. So these are objects floating around in space. They could be debris from some other collision. They could be remnants just floating around, pieces of comets or different things. Whatever it happens to be, that when it's up in space, it's a meteoroid. So we can kind of think of that. We know the term asteroid. We're familiar with that. There's a whole belt of them, right? So those things are in space. Then what we see is a meteor. So for example, we have a meteor shower happening right now. It's going to be peaking sometime next week. So we'll talk a little bit about what that is in a few moments. But as we see these flashes of light come streaking through the sky, that is a meteor. So that is the effect that we see when the meteoroid comes burning up through our atmosphere. And then what we find on the ground afterwards is a meteorite. And again, we can kind of think of that from other terms that we know. That suffix "ite" generally means some type of a mineral or something that we found on the ground or in the ground. So we think of the meteorite then as the rock that we can pick up and study after we've seen the meteor.
All right. So I talked a little bit in the intro about how often NASA says they hit the Earth. So really, how often do these larger things hit the Earth? How often can we see them?
So like you said, we are constantly being bombarded with just tons of material. Most of it is far too small to make it through as it comes streaking through our atmosphere. There's immense amounts of friction, creates a lot of heat, and all of these little particles just burn up in the atmosphere. Most of them don't even create a light that we can see. However, about 10 to 20 fairly good size asteroids come hitting through each day on average. Now, there are times of greater and lesser density in those meteor hits. And like I mentioned before, right now, we are in a period of greater density. We are in what's called the Perseid meteor shower. So what's going on is there are various comets that go around our solar system, one of them being Comet Swift-Tuttle. And it happens to intersect with Earth's orbit. So as that comet is swirling around the sun, it leaves a trail of debris behind it. It's kind of like a messy toddler. And so every so often, when the Earth passes through the point where our orbit intersects with that comet's orbit, we pass through much more of that space junk and debris than we normally do. So we have what's called a meteor shower. And so during a meteor shower, we can see sometimes up to hundreds of meteors a night, depending where you're at. Now, most of those aren't going to be big enough to make it to those 10 or 20 that actually strike the ground, but we have a lot more things happening. So there's much more of a chance of something being big enough that we can actually see that little streak across the sky. And sometimes if we're lucky, we get a great big one that leaves that big glowing streak that actually hangs in the air for a few seconds. And every once in a while, you can even get one that you can hear the boom from as it explodes.
Ooh. So are you familiar with any of the larger meteorite collisions with Earth?
So some of the biggest ones happened a very long time ago, and we've found the meteors. We weren't necessarily documenting when they fell. The biggest by far fell in Namibia, or Namibia. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing that correctly here. Bring my list up. Yes, Namibia. And that one is about 130,000 pounds. It actually is the largest single chunk of iron that we have ever found on the Earth's surface. And we know that it came from space. That one is by far the largest one that we have found. The next largest one is less than half of that at just under 70,000 pounds. I mean, that's pretty puny by comparison, right? 70,000 pounds. Let's not even talk about that guy. But so some of these things can get pretty big.
Okay. Well, Andy Bruno is going to fill us in on some other large impacts. But in Ben Percy's book, The Ninth Metal, some people are hit by some debris from a comet. So how often has that happened? Or has it happened at all?
Well, there is one recorded case of somebody being struck by a meteorite. Now, it's not as glamorous as that might sound on the surface. It's actually more accurate to say their radio was struck by a meteorite, which then bounced off of the radio and hit them in the leg. They did get a pretty good bruise from it. But in terms of recorded history, that's the only run-in we have of where a person was actually struck by a falling meteorite. Now, there are other incidents of buildings and automobiles and things being struck. But when you think about the surface area of the Earth, humans inhabit little pockets that are fairly concentrated and dense, but as a general percentage of the overall surface area, there's a lot of area there to cover. So most of those meteorites fall in uninhabited areas, either in the middle of the ocean, in the desert, in the Australian outback, places where they might be found someday, but we're not necessarily probably going to be standing there when it hits. So luckily, it's very, very rare of anyone actually being struck.
Okay, so if we wanted to see the meteor shower that's coming up and, possibly try to get struck and get superpowers, what's the best way to do that?
So the meteors, as I said, the shower has already started. Now it's going to peak mid next week, which means that each night leading up to that, we're going to be able to see more and more meteors. And then it'll start tapering off after that for a few weeks until it goes back to normal. The best way to observe them, though, is to just go outside, find a nice area with low light pollution, so somewhere out in the country, away from street lights, away from like parking lots and businesses and things, and just throw out a blanket or a lounge chair, lie on the hood of your car and watch the sky. There's no particular area that you need to look at. They can be seen anywhere in the sky. They will all point back to the constellation Perseus. Because as the Earth is moving through this field, that's neat how my hand disappears there. As the Earth is moving through this field of debris, that's the direction we're heading. The Earth is moving towards the constellation Perseus. So kind of like driving through a snowstorm or going into hyperspace, all of those streaks come outward from that central point where we're aimed at, but they're still going to fill up the entire sky. So the tails all point back to Perseus because this is the Perseid meteor shower. But really, anywhere with a dark sky and a nice spot to lay down, you're going to be able to see them anywhere throughout the sky.
Okay, cool. And you've got some mineral samples that you're going to be showing to people. Is that right?
We do. We actually have an event coming up next week. We're doing a STEM cafe all about the Perseid meteor shower. So we're actually going to have some speakers from NASA there, as well as some samples from NASA. So we're going to be getting a couple sets of samples, one with different meteorite samples. Including probably one from that very large meteorite that fell in Namibia. I'm still not saying that right, I'm sure. As well as several other different types of meteorites. We have examples of some very metallic looking meteorites, very rocky looking meteorites, some that are kind of a blend of the two. And then we will also have some samples taken from the actual Apollo missions where astronauts visited the moon. So we'll have some samples of the more kind of shiny crystalline rocks that make up the highlands, the more dull sort of basalts, the volcanic rocks that make up the darker areas, the mares, and as well as some different things that are created during impacts of meteors on the moon that then is found around the craters where debris has flown up from those collisions and impacts.
All right, very cool. Well, once again, remind us where that is and where people can find more information about that.
That is going to be at Open Range Grill, which is part of the Bliss Creek Golf Course. It's a separate business from them, but it's located within the Bliss Creek Golf Course. And that is next Thursday at the observations begin at 6:30 for the moon rocks. And then we'll have speakers beginning at 7. Then we'll have the NASA samples available again afterwards, as well as open observation for people who want to come out and watch the meteors. Or we'll have some telescopes set up to look at different things like Jupiter and Saturn. The telescopes really don't do us much good for the meteors because you have to be looking in just the right spot with the telescope. Really for the meteors, your best bet is, like I said, a lawn chair, but we will have some scopes set up because there will be some other stuff out to see as well.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for setting the stage for us tonight, Jeremy. And thanks for everything that you do to share your knowledge with the world, the school children of America.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to share.
All right, thanks. Okay, next we're going to bring up author Benjamin Percy. So come on in, Ben, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and, of course, the Ninth Metal, your latest novel.
All right, thanks for having me on, Gillian, and I'm happy to nerd it up with everybody tonight. Jeremy, I want to tell you something, even though you are now off stage. It sounds like a tall tale. You're not going to believe it, but my agent, Catherine Fawcett of New Orleans, I'm giving you these details because you can look up the news story. When she was about 12 years old, got out of bed, went to school, and then an hour later, through the roof crashed a meteorite that then burned a hole through her bed, right through her pillow, exploded her mattress.
Oh man, she was destined to be your agent.
They then harvested the meteorites and sold them and paid for her Harvard education with them.
You know, that's amazing because I actually read about her a little bit when I was doing research for this earlier on, and I didn't get her name. I didn't jot that down, but I definitely remember reading about one that crashed through a house in Louisiana, and that's got to be that one. So that's pretty amazing.
An hour earlier, and it would have incinerated her head.
That's good timing. That's serendipity.
Yeah, don't hit the snooze button, kids.
Right. That's the moral of this story.
Uh-huh.
So, the Ninth Metal. Yeah. I think that the prologue to this story is a good billboard for this discussion. So I'm just going to blaze through it. It's really short. And it builds off of a lot of what Jeremy was talking about and hopefully sets up a lot of what Andy's going to talk about. But here it begins. It begins with a comet. Decades ago, an infrared telescope captured the thermal emission streaking through the solar system. Eventually, it was determined to be 300.2 kilometers wide and orbiting the sun in an elongated ellipse that would bring it within 500,000 miles of Earth. The moon, by comparison, is 238,900 miles away. This would be, scientists said, a beautiful light show that everyone should enjoy all the more, knowing we'd narrowly escaped planetary annihilation. The official name of the comet was P/2011 C9, but most people called it Cain, the surname of the astronomer who discovered it. 20 years later, it burned into view and made its close pass by Earth. People took off work. They gathered at soccer fields and in parking lots, on rooftops and along sidewalks, setting up lawn chairs and picnic blankets and grills and coolers as though readying for a fireworks display. Everyone suddenly owned a telescope. Vendors sold Comet t-shirts and hats and keychains and plush stuffed toys. Surfers stacked up on beaches waiting for the big waves they believed would come from the gravitational flux. At least 2 cults killed themselves off, announcing this was the end of the world and the comet a gateway to the vault of heaven. Professors and scientists and religious leaders became regular guests on cable news shows where they talked about how comets had long been associated with meteorological and human disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, droughts. In 44 BC, when Caesar was assassinated, his soul was said to depart the earth and join the comet flaming overhead. In AD 79, a comet's arrival aligned with the eruption of Vesuvius. In AD 684, when Halley's comet passed by, the Black Death broke out. And in 1066, when it made another appearance, William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings. Celestial judgment and providence, or an instrument of the devil, as Pope Calixtus III called it. Heaven knows what awaits us, one professor said. It's a reminder of our irrelevant smallness and accidental existence in the universe, a glimpse of something violently outside the bounds of human existence, as close as you can come to seeing God. Local news reporters interviewed people on the streets. I don't know, it's just kind of cool, one man said. Special, like once in a lifetime sort of deal, you know? You want to be able to say, I was there. It's almost like we're living in this 2-dimensional life or whatever. And now there's this sense of it being 3-dimensional, if you know what I mean. Cain looked like a roughly drawn eye, some said, or a glowing animal track, or a slash mark in the fabric of space, a wandering star. For a few days, the comet made night uncertain, hued with a swampy green light, and by day the sky appeared twinned with suns. And then gradually the comet trailed farther and farther away and people forgot all about it. Until 1 year passed. The planet finished its orbit of the sun and spun into the debris field left by the comet, the residue of Cain's passage. This June, the sky would fall. That's what the newscasters said. The meteor shower was not as long-lasting as August Perseids, but for several nights, the sky flared and streaked and wheeled, the constellations seeming to rearrange themselves with ever-shifting tracks of light. At first hundreds, and then thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and finally an uncountable storm of meteors. The ground shook, windows shattered, grids of electricity went dark, satellites shredded, radio signals scrambled, dogs howled, and people screamed their prayers. Many of the meteors dissolved in the atmosphere, but many struck the earth, sizzling into the ocean, splintering roofs, searing through ice, punching craters into fields and forests and mountainsides like the seeds of the night. It was then that everything changed.
Awesome. Yeah, that does really, sit between our speakers very nicely.
Yeah, there's the marquee comet awesomeness.
Comet awesomeness.
So yeah, I mean, I know we're going to be talking in conversation and everything, but just to give like a germ of the idea, I was in northern Minnesota at the Gunflint Lodge one winter, And there's a fire going, and I was hanging out, and I went over to the hearth, and I was looking at the stone there because it looked really unusual. Unusual enough that I ended up asking a ranger nearby what it was. And he told me about how 2 billion years ago, there was a meteor 10 miles in diameter that struck a location near Sudbury, Ontario. This is known as the Sudbury event. And it was a crater more than 150 miles wide that resulted from this. The ejecta went all over the world. There were tidal waves in the shallow ocean that was there at the time. And, over many millions of years, this material was buried under sediment, and then it was just cemented and fused by molten rock and created a layer. And that layer is available, is at the surface in a few different places, including along the Gunflint Trail in Minnesota. And that exposed layer creates all this weird magnetic chaos. So that if you have a compass along the Gunflint Trail, it spins if you're near some of these rocks, these exposed rocks. And that fireplace is made out of this meteorite. And the voyagers who were collecting furs along the trade routes up there, they would make their gunflint from this meteor layer as well. And so that's when the first germ of the idea, sort of seeded itself. And so many years later, I started to consider how northern Minnesota is this liminal space, right? It's a place where you're not quite sure what is tribal, what is private, what is government, what is US, what is Canada. And it seemed like a really interesting place to have, as a result of that, a story that's about worlds coming together, that's about a cosmic event. It seemed like a good stage for that, along with the fact that I've spent a lot of time in this area. I'm really interested in it as a place to live, not just as a stage for my fiction, but it used to be Steel Central. Like the Iron Range of Minnesota used to be this place where all the steel in the world came from. And like so many Rust Belt areas of the Midwest, right, that's receded. There's still taconite being produced and shipped off from there. But there's been economic collapse. And there's a lot of discussion about the heyday of these communities. And there's also a lot of battles going on right now about more mines opening up in the boundary water areas for copper, nickel. And so it just occurred to me, like, what if this meteor that hit 2 billion years ago, what if something like that hit today instead? And what if the substance that it brought to the Earth, didn't come from the Oort cloud, didn't contain materials that even belonged on the periodic table, but instead, I have this substance called omnimetal. And I talked a lot with this nerdy professor buddy of mine at Carleton, this physicist, and figured out the slippery science of it. But it's very marvelly in that it absorbs energy. It can absorb energy on a quantum level. And as a result of that, it upends the energy sector, it upends the weapons sector. It makes, and I can talk further more about this later, but it makes the middle of nowhere into the center of everything.
Excellent. All right, that's very cool. And there's a lot of things I want to touch on, but first let's bring Andy Bruno into the conversation to talk about some other history in Russia.
Hi, thanks everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation. Just a little bit more on my background on how I'm coming to this, and then I'll talk about my project. So I'm first and foremost an environmental historian of Russia. So spent a lot of time in Russia. My first book was on the Arctic in Russia and industrial impacts of development there. And then I was looking for a different story, something that involved Russia, involved the environment, but kind of gave us a different way to think about human relationships with the natural world over time. And I also wanted a fascinating story. I mean, I've written for academic presses, and that's most of my stuff, but I wanted to sort of lean into having a good story. And then sort of came upon this event, this explosion in Siberia in 1908 called the Tunguska event. And that's, essentially I've been spending the last couple of years researching and writing this book. I'm supposed to have it, I will have it to the press in a couple of weeks, so it's almost done. And what I've kind of came to, so I'm going to go through the chapters a bit, but mostly as a way to sort of tell the story. One of the sort of big takeaways that I kind of came to was that this is a story that allows us to think about mystery and its role in environmental history, its role in how humans have interacted with the natural world. Because this event, both because of the sort of actual circumstances, material circumstances around it that confound human understandings, and because of the culture, how the history develops and unfolds, and the human representations and meanings assigned to it, becomes known as a mystery. And then because of that, we have this very odd circumstances where this landscape is engaged with, it makes the area of Minnesota seem like the center of the world. This is how remote this is. This landscape becomes primarily engaged with from the standpoint of mystery. And you get engagement with the landscape being based on the effort to solve the mystery. You get different types of knowledge, different forms of alternative science, sometimes maligned as pseudoscience, sometimes sort of at that boundary, that come to existence, and then you also have different ways of conceiving of disasters. Now, this image right here is essentially what confronted people who came upon it. You just have all of these trees where the site of this explosion occurred, and they didn't come upon it until 20 years later, but they come upon it, and there's all these trees uprooted, facing the same direction, all going out from center point. Seemed like a meteorite, right? And that's sort of becomes the working hypothesis. But let me go back for now for a second to give you a sense of what it was like. So we heard already that only one person seemed to have been struck by a meteorite. There have been people who've been injured by meteorites. And one of the things about Tunguska is, assuming it's a meteorite event, which it is, it's the largest one in recorded history in the last several thousand years. Had it hit Chicago, Chicago would have been decimated in terms of the size of the explosion that was released from it. But as you see from this map, it was not only in the middle of Siberia, it was not even near the urban centers of Siberia. It was near about 45 kilometers or 65 kilometers north of a small trading post called Vanavara. Dear one that happened, the area where there were people who were living there, they were mostly Evenki. This is an indigenous Siberian group. And at least one of them, Ivan Makachurgu, died. He didn't die immediately from the explosion, but his arm got hurt, and then it got infected and he passed away. And possibly two others, perhaps more actually did die. And this is, I'm emphasizing this because a common line about this event has been no one died, even though it was such a big explosion. Actually, we do have pretty good evidence that a couple of people died. So one of the things though that I find is really interesting when looking at the event itself is that this allows us to see a cosmic collision more closer to how we view other natural disasters like earthquakes or hurricanes, where it's not just, of course, how big the hazard was, how destructive it was. It's completely embedded in social and cultural relationships with people. Who's living where because of what affects who is vulnerable to disaster and how it affected people. And here's a case where even something as sort of wild as a collision of a meteorite had that came to play now. Now I said that this happened in 1908. That said, it was remote, and it was sort of soon forgotten about. There was evidence that happened. There was some, references into it in Siberian newspapers, but then it was sort of forgotten about. In the meantime, Russia has, goes into World War I, has 2 revolutions that eventually brings the Bolshevik regime to power, create the Soviet Union. And then in the 1920s, you get this guy, Leonid Kulik, who hears about this event and then decides to go find this missing meteorite. He makes several efforts, but only gets there in 1927 with the help of Evenki, and begins a process of expeditions. Now, what he's expecting is, okay, there's a big meteorite fall there. He sees all this destruction, but there's going to be a crater and there's going to be remnants on the ground. He doesn't find those. No one has found those. Because of that, because of sort of the way publicity around the event, this Tunguska event, the Tunguska meteorite, becomes a public mystery. And it's not for want of trying. They do all sorts of things. They think that it must be in this one depression that's a thermokarst depression in the permafrost, and they dig a big tunnel and let the water out, and there's a tree stump there, which is a pretty good sign that there had not been an explosion of a meteorite that landed there. These arduous adventures in the late 20s and 30s to get to the site end up not finding it. Kulik becomes very well known. He gets in lots of fights with lots of people, and he eventually dies in a Nazi POW camp in the 1940s. After the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, this guy on the side there, a fiction writer, a science fiction writer named Alexander Kazansoff, writes a story called Explosion that puzzles over this. Okay, what could have caused an explosion that big if it wasn't a meteorite? Well, maybe something nuclear. How could there have been a nuclear explosion in 1908? Could a meteorite have been made of uranium? He talks to some people, decides that it wasn't impossible. It must have been a nuclear explosion. How could that have been? Well, it must have been a spaceship that was run on nuclear power that exploded over Siberia in 1908. He writes this as a fictional story. A few months later, the New York Times chimes in that the Soviets have a new theory for explaining the Tunguska explosion. Kazansoff himself seemed to, at this point, still think it was a story, but then kind of becomes convinced by his own idea, puts on this show at the Moscow Planetarium that essentially promotes this as a possibility. And that gets all of the meteorite specialists in the Soviet Union very upset. And there's a whole big controversy about this. But of course, this sort of idea that fiction becomes a realm for thinking and a realm for producing science stays with the Tunguska story. And in the late 1950s, there's a group of Siberian students, some of whom I met. I met this guy on this bottom here with the hat, and this guy in the back here with the glasses, decide to go to the Tunguska site themselves to see if Kazansoff was right, to see if there's a spaceship there. And they begin this endeavor called the Complex Amateur Expedition that starts to investigate Tunguska and goes out to the site every summer, or almost every summer for decades, to try to find evidence of a meteorite. In the meantime, the mainstream scientists come around to the idea that this must be a comet instead of a meteorite, because that would explain how maybe it had a low enough density to explode above ground. Now, on these I'm realizing I'm running low on time. So on these amateur expeditions, it's important to also underscore what this was in the Soviet Union. This was a very sort of unique type of culture. These people spent the whole summer out there. They felt very dedicated to this mission. They paid their own way to do it. It was somewhat of a camping trip, but a somewhat of like leisure, a combination of science and leisure for many of these people. And they debated whether or not Tunguska was a meteorite or a comet or an alien spaceship or tons of other explanations that came into the fray. Antimatter, mere matter, miniature black hole. By the 1980s, you have people talking about how Nikola Tesla might have had an experiment that went awry. And they would have these discussions and they'd sing their songs around the campfire, and kind of, became a sort of valued place within Soviet society for these people. Now, another thing that happens is that, that with the Tunguska story is that by the 80s, there actually does start to be industrial encroachment on this site. There's geological prospecting in the area, and this gets all of the researchers together in order to create a nature reserve on the territory, which is today the Tunguska State Nature Reserve, or Zapovednik. And so it protects it, but it also then kind of ends up marginalizing some of these amateur researchers from the ability to get to the site as easily as they had in the past. This landscape really becomes a sort of special place for all of them. In the final chapter, my main chapter, I look, I sort of, in the book, I privilege the Soviet story for a lot of reasons, including that the literature, the sort of book-length literature in English about Tunguska tends to privilege the foreign story because the writers don't read Russian. But then I sort of go through and look at how this has been debated about from internationally, including the ways that sort of some of the founding debates about in the meteoritics discipline in America kind of came into existence through through people like Harvey Ninninger and Lincoln La Paz debating about the Tunguska meteorite. You also have some, from abroad, you have some very well established scientists come up with fairly wild speculations that could probably only have happened from not having the ability to do on-site fieldwork. You also do get some collaboration here in Moscow is Yevgeny Klinov, who's one of the main meteorite specialists in the Soviet Union. And on the end here is Fred Whipple, who's one of the major astronomers and was the head of the Smithsonian Institute in the US for many decades. The Smithsonian Astronomical Institute for many decades. All of this though, so by the 90s, by the late 80s and 90s, the consensus, if there is one, came to be that it wasn't a comet, but it was simply a stony asteroid, not a metallic asteroid, that burst in the air, and that things like that would explain why there wasn't a crater, that would explain why, and actually give you good enough evidence that 20 years later, it became very hard to find any remnants of it, given the estimates of the size of the explosion. This sort of idea comes again in the 80s and early 90s, and then you have a couple things that happen. One was the Shoemaker-Levy 9 incident in 1994, when a comet hits Jupiter, and the scientists had sort of known this was coming and analyzed it, and were able to deduce some of how these impacts can possibly occur. And the other was another Russian meteorite event, the Chelyabinsk meteorite in 2013, when you had an airburst explosion. You have all of these dash cam videos of Russia, of sort of people in their cars seeing it, some of them going, whoa, some of them going, what the F, some of them, not seeming to mind at all, some of them being hit by glass and hurt. And even Gennady Plekhanov, this one person I mentioned before, who was one of the people who initially wanted to go find a spaceship in Tunguska, said, that's it, I've been convinced now. It was just a piece of a stony asteroid that exploded in the air. Not technically a meteorite, because a meteorite technically has to hit the ground, but essentially that's the same thing as what we'd understand as a meteorite. Now, I conclude the book with thinking a little bit about what it means for today. This is an image that was taken in Vanavara. When I got to Vanavara, I got to see the Tunguska site from a helicopter, but I did not get to go walk around the site myself. And that was because there were forest fires. Forest fires are common in the Siberian taiga, but have grown worse with climate change. And this image, I stood right there, but this image was actually taken in 2019 when the forest fires near Vanavara were even worse. And of course, this girl is wearing a mask, which by the time I'm, writing the conclusion, I'm putting on my mask to go outside because of another natural disaster. And I sort of use this mounting ecological and environmental threats of the world today to sort of, or I use the Tunguska event to sort of riff on some of how we might think about the threats of the past and the threats of today, and the ways that some things go beyond, global capitalism and the things that cause carbon emissions and all of that, and are sort of, longer lasting, but also that the Tunguska story shows us that we've lived with cosmic catastrophe before, and that, as a theorist says, Donna Haraway, but we kind of need to stay with the trouble and not sort of go the Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk route of trying to escape our planet, but actually try to, the lesson I think we should take from this Tunguska story is embedding ourselves in the world that we know. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went a little bit over, but thanks.
All right. No, thank you. That was great. I love that idea of staying with the trouble. I feel like that could almost be a tagline for Ben's book too. So let's bring Ben back in. I have a lot of questions, but I imagine that you two probably have some questions for each other. There's so much overlap in the things that you're thinking about, even though you're approaching it from different disciplines. So what questions do you have for each other?
That was a great presentation, Andy. I'm really interested. I want to dig up more. I'm going to have to pick up your book and also do a internet rabbit hole on the subject. One of the things I've always been curious about with comets is the speculation that they're not just composed of particulates and likely frozen water, but also potentially mirror matter or antimatter, dark matter, however you want to talk about it. But and the idea of there being this impact that you discussed, but no remnants left behind, seems to potentially, I mean, I know that there are various theories swirling about that moment, but it seems to speak to that possibility. I mean, especially when it comes to the dark matter of it all. Can you riff on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, so I don't know too much about any theories about dark matter, but I do know something about theories about mirror matter, which is a little bit different. It's closer to antimatter, but it's not antimatter is matter where you have, a sort of opposite charge of a proton or a particle that in theory, if it were to hit it, would, annihilate each other. And it's been theorized and it clearly exists. Mirror matter is a little bit more wild and it's a little bit more on the sort of theoretical end of things. But of those who've theorized it, there's the sense that maybe this is, and so the difference was that it's not an opposite charge, it's an opposite sort of structure. So a mirror image of a particle. And there is, I mean, I'd say that's one of the non-meteorite comet explanations that are being most investigated. There's a Czech researcher named Günter Klička, who I met actually in Valdivara, who is very interested in sort of explaining Tunguska because of that. And now, I should emphasize, I'm agnostic. I mean, I kind of think the main explanation is right, but I'm also understand the limits of my own specialist knowledge about it. So when he starts
I
talking,
kind of like what Gunter has to say myself.
yes,
Let's keep
yes.
talking about Gunter.
Yes, well, I think he might be in Chicago at the Meteorite conference in a couple weeks. So I mean, I think that, and that's sort of where the miniature black hole, where the antimatter theories all came from, was how can you not have remnants with this big explosion, and the nuclear theory. That's all of these come from this idea that how can you have such a big explosion without remnants? And I mean, I would just say that I think that that's a legitimate mystery. As well as sort of, sometimes it gave fodder for creativity that might extend beyond what is verifiable. But if you, another thing I very much was hammered into me through this research is just how much ufologists and people interested in paranormal activity and all that, how much they're also empiricists, how much they really want to sort of find evidence for their theories. I mean, they don't convince me, but it's not because they don't they're ignorant of the topic. It's just that they, are basing it on certain premises that I don't find trustworthy. So I wanted to ask you, Ben, about sort of the environmental themes of your story and where you think you might. I mean, if I understand correctly, this is book one of a trilogy. So
That's
some
right.
of it you probably don't have all planned out. Some of it you're not going to want to give away necessarily. But what becomes of Omni-Metal, and what becomes of sort of the energy future of the planet, and all of these perils that the world's facing today.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was talking before about some of the inspiration for the story, and to bring something else into the fray, I spent a lot of time researching the Bakken oil formation in North Dakota. I was really interested in how there was this Deadwood 2.0 essentially going on there, this boom town where as a result of all the mineral rights being snatched up, all the wells being dug, the motto of the state became $1 million a day. And you had roughnecks shipping in from all across the world. You had a rise in prostitution. You had a rise in drug use. There were bodies found in shallow graves. Every hotel and motel was full for 200 miles. Man camps were formed. That's what they were referred to as, they would just bring in trailer and set up these massive parks, and there'd be 14 dudes in a trailer. And it just became a, contemporary Wild West. And so I transposed that idea upon northern Minnesota. And, with that, I tried to capture all of those different points of view, right? So I have characters who are the original landowners. I have characters who are, and sometimes there's intersections here, but, trying to protect the boundary waters, trying to protect the gunflint, the Iron Range. I have those who come from outside the state, those who, are, for example, part of the Black Dog Energy Company in Texas and Alaska, and they're coming there to exploit the situation. I have cops, I have government agents, I have a Department of Defense lab, and everybody has, a different opinion on what's happening. I don't side with, as an author, I'm not trying to side with any particular opinion here. And it's been interesting to see how when people encounter this cross-section of humanity, they sometimes think, oh, you're siding with the environmentalists. I've had some people up in northern Minnesota who are upset about that and refer to it as leftist propaganda. And maybe there is a little bit of that in there. But I've also have people who are taking the opposite view of the book, because I have some sympathetic set of characters on the other side. But the idea of it was to try to raise questions instead of answer them. And also with science fiction, with fantasy, with horror, it's oftentimes the case that they channel cultural unease. They take a knife to the nerve of the moment. They offer up a cracked mirror view of our reality. If you look at everything from Frankenstein, which was born out of the Industrial Revolution and has to do with the fear of man playing God, the fear of science and technology. If you look at Godzilla and how it's connected to post-atomic anxieties. If you look at Invasion of the Body Snatchers and how it's born out of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and the Living Dead films, right, in every era in which they're produced, they sort of take a different cultural moment and make it into a metaphor. And anyways, with that in mind, in writing this novel, I was aware of the moment that we're in. It's a moment where, you know, we are facing environmental cataclysm as a result of our recklessness and greed. You know, you look at the storm swirling off the Gulf, you look at the firestorm out west, and it's kind of terrifying, right? And so by offering up a fantastic subject matter, a fantastical subject matter, a speculative story, you're able to, as a writer, approach some of those same, let's say, subjects that would immediately turn off somebody if they appeared in the editorial page of a newspaper. You're able to emotionally draw people in and talk about the same things, but in an indirect way. And so that is in part the impetus for this first novel.
I think both of your works kind of deal with this idea of the myths of the place. So how does the Tunguska event play into kind of the pop culture of now? Is it something that they think about in Russia? Is it something that they're proud of, like the Ben's story about the lodge? Where do we see it now in that context?
So if I could answer both historically, I'm a historian, so historically and today, I mean, it's huge, right? It's something that, especially of a certain generation, is very well known. Sometimes it's called the Russian Roswell, which I think kind of gets at its prominence, at least in Russian pop culture. And you know, you'd have these sort of magazines, Knowledge is Power, Technology for the Youth, that would just have endless reporting about this Tunguska event and the newest ideas and the newest theories and the newest expeditions throughout the Soviet period and beyond. It also becomes internationally really important. So Kazansoff's one sort of science fiction writer who then influences the science of it, but then you have others, you know, everyone from Thomas Pynchon to unknown writers to in Russia, you have some of the most famous science fiction writers, Boris and Arkady Strugatsky. There's a film, Stalker, which somewhat, you know, it's a famous Soviet film that somewhat reflects the Tunguska zone, the idea of the place, the mythology of the place. It's not exactly, but there's influence there. And then you have, you know, there's one of the most famous contemporary novelists, Vladimir Sorokin, has this trilogy, the Ice trilogy, that all starts with, they find the Tunguska, what caused the Tunguska, and it was ice. And then you have these mystical Aryans that hammer people's chests, and it's very dystopian actually in the end. But it's still being played at with very much as a sort of major trope of pop culture. And then that goes beyond that. There's a Metallica song, there's some X-Files episodes, there's comics books, there's all sorts of things that refer to this event internationally as a and sort of create new myths around it. I mean, the Tesla thing is I think the biggest interesting thing, where some guy writes an article in 1990 about maybe it was Tesla's death ray that caused it. Tesla was trying to send an experimental signal to Robert Peary, who was getting ready to go to the North Pole, and missed, and his death ray caused the Tunguska explosion. I mean, and this is,
I
very
believe
little is based in any sort of, this, but is, you now find books in Russia. This came from an American, but you found books in Russia, Tesla and Tunguska and things like that. So.
Tesla death ray. Yes.
Yeah, of course.
So Ben, what do you think about that, about being influenced by the myths of a place? I know you've written about mystery lights and things like that. So how does that influence the stories that you want to tell?
Well, I've lived in Minnesota now for 9 years, and this is the first novel that I've written that's set here. And the reason for that is, previous to this, all my books were set in the Pacific Northwest, which is where I grew up and felt like I, could authenticate it. But I've lived in the Midwest for, I don't know how long, I guess since 2001. I've lived in Minnesota 9 years, and it's only now that I felt like I could write not just about the geography of the place, but about the culture, the politics, the vernacular, and the myths. Right? I grew up in the shadow of Bigfoot, and now I'm living in the shadow of Paul Bunyan. And so, yeah, I've been reading everything and watching everything that I can get my paws on, while also taking careful notes. And the mythology of the area is something I want to mine as best I can, because I feel like I'm, as a fiction writer, contributing to it. I'm in conversation with it. And so the same thing goes for, let's say, the comic books that I write, right? I wrote for DC Comics. I write now for Marvel Comics. I write X-Force and I write Wolverine for Marvel. And when I write, when I take on a series, when I'm first asked to pitch a series, what I typically do is a deep dive. So they say, you interested in writing Green Arrow? And I say, hell yeah. And then I have to come up with a take, because typically you're up against like 5 different writers in a bake-off, as it's known. And so what I do is I read all the Green Arrow comics that I can find, despite being familiar with the character already. I graph out who are the best sidekicks, love interests, what are the weakest attributes, what are the core characteristics, who are the best villains, what's been lost from the character that needs to be brought back, how can I give it a signature take. Everybody wants not just you to be doing karaoke as a writer of comics, but they want you to be doing like your own unique take that's within the elastic parameters of what's permitted with that character. And so with that in mind, you're tipping your hat to legacy when you're writing for the big two, writing for DC, writing for Marvel, because people show up for Wolverine knowing who that character is and wanting some familiarity there, even as they're looking for a fresh take. And so I guess you could say that the same thing is in a way true when writing about northern Minnesota, right? That you have to be familiar with Lutheran culture, Ojibwe culture. You have to be familiar with the fact that it has more shoreline than anywhere else in the country. You have to be familiar with the geology and the anthropology and just the small town politics of the place. And is there a hodag? Are the northern lights dancing spirits, like what that the wolves are calling to? Like what about the Edmund Fitzgerald? And so on and so forth. Like if you don't know that stuff and absorb that stuff, then you're immediately marked as a tourist perspective.
Do you want to tell people who aren't familiar with the hodag, especially? Tell us about the hodag.
Well, in Oregon, we have Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and my sister to this day claims she has seen Sasquatch twice. So that's what I grew up familiar with and kind of obsessed with. But every part of the country, of course, has their own mythological creature, and sometimes it's something, a cousin to Bigfoot, like I think it's called the skunk ape of North Carolina. But Wisconsin and Minnesota have the hodag. And the hodag, I'm still trying to figure out. I've heard different iterations of it, but it's, it's a beast of the woods. It's, I guess you could say another version of the chupacabra of the North. Would you correct me on that, Gillian?
No, I don't know if it sucks goats or anything, but yeah, that's kind of how I've heard of
Probably
it.
sucks like black bear blood or something.
Yeah, probably.
Yes.
But and in Southern Illinois, where we went to grad school, they had the Big Muddy Monster,
Ooh,
which
yeah.
was kind of another iteration of that. So I'm
And
gonna
clearly
open it up.
Andy, who expresses hesitation in his belief, has not watched enough Ghost Hunters.
Well, I do want to say one sort of thing that overlapping with this whole Tunguska alien hunters was that, the Soviet Academy of Science actually had a Yeti expedition around the same time as these amateurs started going out there and we're looking for, the abominable snowman Yeti in the Pamir Mountains in the south. Didn't find him, but I met some people in my research who very much insist that he's out there.
Oh, he is.
And Andy, you were telling me earlier that you had the chance to interview these amateur, or maybe they weren't amateur, Soviet alien hunters. So do you want to say anything about that?
So this is one of the joys of this research is, so I went to Tomsk. I did research in a bunch of Russian studies, but I went to Tomsk and I just happened to last minute email this woman, Nina Antonigenova, who is the daughter of a sort of relatively prominent Tunguska researcher, John, his name's actually John, Antonigenov. And she was like, oh yeah, sure, I'll introduce you to my parents. The guy who went on the first of these expeditions in the 1950s is still around. And then so they hosted me we had enjoyed some cognac and he told me all about his ideas. And he, when I say alien hunters, I'm being a little bit, I'm saying it in the most sensational way possible because these were amateur scientists in terms of this wasn't their profession, but voluntary is probably a better term for it because they were very much at this mix. They entertained these sort of very, ideas that pushed on the edge of science, but most of them weren't like, well, it had to be this, right? They were interested in the investigation itself and kind of had an open-minded sense of it. But learning from them was really, really fascinating. I just, I through that it snowballed and collected all sorts of stories that then sort of now appear in the book and sort of enrich it. This is one of the things, right? One, I'm an academic historian, so I have all sorts of I have to mix historiographical arguments, make analytical arguments and all of that. But I'm also a writer, but I can't think, what does Wolverine want to do today? I gotta find the juicy quotes. And luckily I got a lot of juicy quotes and sort of lively perspective from these interviews that then I was able to bring in to get the sort of lived experience of these expeditions much more vividly than I had, I sort of kind of became an inadvertent oral historian, which was wonderful.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of great stories. So I will direct people now to the Q&A. If there's any questions you want to ask Andy and Ben, put those in the Q&A and we will try to get to as many as possible. But I also want to say, Andy, because you're not writing Wolverine, what would you like to see in a fictional story that used the Tunguska event as kind of background? Is there something that really sticks out that you're just like, oh, I wish this was a novel?
That's a great question. I'm not sure what I'd say, but I think something that actually got at that really based it on these experiences during the expeditions, because I think those were in themselves really special. The event itself is really special. The wild ideas or the mystery around it is very special, but the fact that you have all of these people going out and spending 2 months of their summer for years in a row, living in the taiga wilderness, I think a lot could be imagined about that. So I would love to read that. But I mean, you know, there's a lot that's been written, and I think it's something that will continue to be used a lot. I just sorry,
Okay.
something popped up. Sorry.
Yeah. And Ben, so what do you think? Would you like to throw out any riffs on Tunguska that you'd like to see appear?
Well, first, just in response to Andy's question, he made it sound like it's hard to figure out what Wolverine wants to do every day, you know, and the answer is one of three things, you know, smoke cigars, drink bourbon, or kick some ass. It's not that hard to be a fiction writer.
Done.
Give me the Marvel contract. No, I'm actually in the process of writing book 3 right now of the trilogy. The second book comes out in January. It's called The Unfamiliar Garden. So every one of these books actually takes place simultaneously. I wanted to fight attrition because typically if you have a series, every single book in a series sells fewer copies. So, you know, my evil genius marketing idea was to have not only the books come out in quick succession, because it's also annoying that George R.R. Martin still hasn't published The Winds of Winter. For God's sake, George. You know, people lose touch with the momentum of these series. So I wanted them to come out in quick succession. I also wanted to fight attrition by having them happen simultaneously, so you could read them in any particular order. So the first book takes place in northern Minnesota. The second book takes place in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington, in the Olympics, in Seattle, the wettest corner of our country, which is where alien plant life would be most likely to take root. The third book takes place in Alaska, and I've been up to Alaska several times, and for fishing and some outdoor stuff. And anyways, when I was in Fairbanks this one time, I learned how there are all these experimental weather stations there, and these LiDAR stations where they're sending off blasts of energy into the atmosphere. There's a long history of these in the region. I became really interested in that idea. And so by the third book, what you're going to ultimately understand, there's a reason that the comet contains life that is off the periodic table, and that I'm introducing the idea of, you know, us being responsible. And here we cycle back to sort of my original intentions and sort of channeling the moment, you know, that we are responsible for the comet, in that we have opened up through some of these experiments a seam that released this blast. You know, I opened up the possibility of the multiverse there. And so that's, you know, the explanation for some of this matter that scientists can't quite wrap their heads around is there. But with that, you know, I asked that question earlier about the strike and the lack of remnants for a reason, because I'm doing all sorts of research right now into dark matter and into mirror matter, and trying to figure out, you know, when it comes to multiversal possibilities, how they might be sort of a key to the lock.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if any of that triggers anything in your mind. You know, when it comes to figures stepping through portals in northern Russia or anything else, but I'm definitely going to incorporate some of the goodness of this conversation into the last novel.
Yeah.
I don't got anything for you in terms of of multiverses, and I think that goes beyond my pay grade. But
Come on, Andy. Come on.
I love that idea that you both brought up, though, of fiction reacting to science and then science reacting to fiction. I think that you both hit on some really great examples, and you know, that's what we like to do here is be even more intentional about that. Like, how can we bring these two communities together? So Ben, and speaking of different communities, you have written in a lot of different genres. You started with more literary fiction, and then horror and comics, and now sci-fi. So how are comics different than your more literary fiction?
Well, I grew up on genre fiction. So I grew up on vampires and robots with laser eyes and dragons and barbarians with woolly underpants. Like those are my four favorite genres. Barbarians with woolly underpants, especially. Went through a phase. And anyways, when I got to when I stepped into my first creative writing classroom as an undergrad and then on into grad school, I was told the same thing over and over again, which was genre was not permitted, that plot was a dirty word. And so I fell in love with literary fiction. I fell in love with writers like James Baldwin and Alice Munro and Flannery O'Connor and Leslie Silko. But I never fell out of love with genre. And I think that it's actually what the unnatural thing to note is that I actually wrote literary fiction. When I arrived in my first creative writing classroom, I had no idea who Raymond Carver was. And so what I was doing was writing literary fiction as a genre of its own. I was recognizing the techniques, I was recognizing the patterns, and just using that to influence me because that was the audience, the self-selecting audience of the MFA program, you could say. And one of the things that happened later was I read this book. It was in Brady Udall's class called Thrilling Tales. And it really had a big impact on me. It was edited by Michael Chabon. It was originally published as a McSweeney's literary journal. And Michael Chabon had asked all these different contributors to, publish, to write the kind of story that they would have loved when growing up. And I really felt like I had lost touch with that. I had lost touch with why I wanted to be a writer. And so I asked myself, like, hypothetically, if I had been invited to contribute to this anthology, what kind of story would I have written? And that's when I started to recognize, like, the sort of writer I wanted to be, which was neither fish nor fowl, not literary and not genre. I wanted to, yes, do all those things that literary writers do well, like have three-dimensional characters and pretty prose and, three subterranean themes and glowing metaphors. But, the weakness of a lot of literary fiction is that nothing happens. People have some deep thoughts and it's really beautiful. But with genre fiction, even though you can criticize it as well and say, oh, the prose is pedestrian, the characters are types, the plots are formulaic, like the thing that genre fiction never forgets is that, all six cylinders need to always be blazing. Like, what happens next? That's the fundamental question. That's why most people read. You want to know what happens next. You want to turn those pages so quickly they make a breeze on your face. And so, I wanted to become that kind of writer like Margaret Atwood or Susanna Clarke or Kate Atkinson or Dennis Lehane or Peter Straub or Cormac McCarthy, who, like, where do they belong in the bookstore? It's never exactly clear, and so in writing across all these genres or in writing across all these different mediums, one of the things that keeps me excited at the keyboard every day is that I'm having to constantly relearn my storytelling arsenal, to change up my storytelling techniques. So with comics, for instance, and I'm still learning, you have 5 to 7 scenes in 20 pages, not 18 pages, not 24 pages, you have 20 pages. There's an A plot, a B plot, a C plot, and a D plot. The B plot of one issue becomes the A plot of the next. The C plot becomes the B plot. Terrence Hayes, the poet, talks about how writing free verse poetry versus writing form poetry like a villanelle or a sonnet. He says this, he says, it's cool if you can breakdance, but it's badass if you can breakdance in a straitjacket. And I feel like writing comics is breakdancing in a straitjacket, and that it's such a constrained form, but sometimes that constraint can be inspiring. And there's all sorts of things that I've discovered through comics writing, and it's usually an exaggerated or more bombastic version of what I'm doing in my fiction. I'm discovering these things that I then apply to my novels. I think writing comics has made me a better novelist because it makes you so much more efficient, but also because it makes really explicit certain things that maybe I wasn't able to grasp with the more ephemeral study of literary novels, especially, which is like, for instance, and I could rant about this for 3 hours, but here's one thing: the core wound of a character, right? Almost every character in comics has a core wound or key insight. It's often referred to in screenwriting. Bruce Wayne would not be the Batman if not for his core wound, which is that Martha and Thomas Wayne were killed in Crime Alley, blood and pearls splattered everywhere, rain, sadness. Bruce Wayne becomes the Batman because he wants to bring law and order to the chaos of Gotham City, all born out of that moment. Same thing goes with Uncle Ben being killed by a burglar in Spider-Man, and Frank Castle's wife and child being killed by the mob, and so, this key insight, what it typically does is it's an internal wound that finds an external counterpart, analog, in the villain of the story, right? So if you're doing it right, every single, I'll talk about Batman's rogues because they're the best villains. Every single villain in Batman should be about some internal fissure within Bruce. For instance, every single Scarecrow story should be about fear, right? I talked about the fear of Crime Alley, or the fear when Bruce fell into that that cave full of bats. Well, he and Scarecrow are both dark mirrors of one another in that they both had traumatic childhoods. Scarecrow's father experimented on him as a psychologist with fear experiments and fear serums. They both have taken that fear and weaponized it, right? It should be about fear. Every story about Two-Face should be about that fundamental question: is Bruce Wayne the man and Batman the mask, or is Batman the real guy and Bruce Wayne the mask? And I can just go through all of them. Dr. Freeze is all about Bruce's emotional coldness, and on and on and on I can go. So there's a few instances right there of how comics have sort of taught me, through their technicolor elements, their high volume elements, some of the things that are more subtly employed in standard fiction writing. This concludes my TED Talk.
Yes. No, that's great. I think it's really interesting what you're saying about talking about internal wounds and external wounds. And you both have spent a good amount of time thinking about these impacts into the earth. So there's a literal wound in the earth, and everything that came after that. So I want to talk about what you two both think about the environment in your work. But I also want to think about what you think about the idea of this crater, this impact, being a wound, and how did people react to it in that way?
Andy, go.
Well, okay, so I'm not going to actually answer your question all that well, but I'll use it as a reason to talk about something else. One thing, of course, is there wasn't exactly a crater, but there was this fallen forest. There was, they mapped it out, 2,150 square kilometers of fallen forest, and a sort of all going out in a butterfly shape. But what I would talk about is what some of the initial ideas about what happened that came from the indigenous people who were witnesses. And one of it, it's hard because, we get this through Soviet ethnographers who were, trying to stomp out Evenki shamans at the same time they were trying to learn about everything they could about it. But there's good evidence that one of the main ways that Evenki viewed this was that a spirit named Ogdi had been sort of summoned by a shaman to seek revenge on a different clan, and an iron bird, this is almost comic book like, an iron bird sort of came through and threw fireballs at everything, right? And then the spot became cursed, and they were supposed to avoid this cursed spot. And this is pretty strong evidence that even by the point of the expeditions, Soviet expeditions in the 1920s, some the Evenki would be like, yeah, okay, it's over there, but we don't want to go. And then it was only gradually with time that they would go to the site themselves. Now this has, there's many possibilities for this that might have to do with, well, people died there and there was a taboo against going to where you didn't go back to visit your relatives in Evenki culture. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things that could have explained this. And then I just want to say about this genre thing and writing. I mean, I think this is, it's a very different thing, of course, writing nonfiction and writing academic works. But I do think that there is this, the idea of like this, the straitjacket, and, I think that that's kind of how I felt with trying to tell it as a story, trying to, like lean into some more, literary devices and just trying to make it well written while also trying to have it be a clear argument, I think is also in a way, breakdancing in a straitjacket, because, the best people who do it are just amazing at it, but there's always like, oh wait, but I'm not talking about this scholar's conceptions of this because I don't want to bog down the story, right? But, but I really need to do this here. And so there's different ways that kind of comes in as well.
Nice. Yeah. And if I was talking about the wound, if you look at the book that I wrote, I'm using the impact, the night of the primary impact as a kind of scar that all the characters are scratching at in different ways. I have one character who on the night that the meteors fall loses his family. And so that's his key insight. I have another character who hits rock bottom that night. He's in the middle of this robbery. He's drug-addled, strung out, and it's only because he gets hit and nearly killed in that moment that he's able to sort of reorient his life and become, thereafter on a mission of atonement. And you have other characters who the greed begins that night. The possibility of fabulous wealth drives them to extremes. So there's this thing, right? And it leaches out of everybody all sorts of different emotional possibilities. I'm thinking of something just accidentally that I encountered. I watched Picnic at Hanging Rock 2 nights ago, and I can't stop thinking of it. And in a way, it bears a strong resemblance to what I'm talking about, even though I, again, saw it 2 nights ago and not 2 years ago. But it has to do with this, geologic formation in Australia. And this group of boarding school girls goes out to have a picnic there. And 4 of them, one of them is later found, disappear that day. And it creates just in all of the other characters, these fault lines. And some of them are driven mad. Some of them are driven to despair. Some of them completely change their values. Others commit suicide. Some move away, all because of this one wounded geography. So in stories, there's always the thing and the other thing, to put it in the most simple of terms.
All right. We are almost out of time. So I want to give you both a chance to say any final thoughts, any final questions that you have for each other. It went really fast to me. So what did we miss? What else did you want to share? What other questions did you have for each other?
Well, I'll simply say that Andy might be receiving some annoying emails from me in the near future asking for more information, especially about the slippery science and paranormal explanations for the event. So that was really a fascinating lecture you gave.
Thank you. And I think I told Gillian that I was going to try to read the Ninth Metal before this conversation. And I haven't got it yet, but I very much am excited to
thanks.
read it. But hopefully,
don't feel too bad. You have that in common with millions of other people.
So, and where can people find more about your work? And Ben, I know you had a bookstore that we'd like to give a shout out to as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you can find my books anywhere. You might want to order them, but if you want me to to sign a book for you, or if you want to give it as a gift to somebody, have me sign and personalize it. You know, I can give it a dental signature, like chew on it, or sign it in my blood, or with a tuft of beard in it, or however you want me to do it. Like my local bookshop is Content Books in Northfield, Minnesota. And we've got a deal set up where if you order through them and just say on your order form, have Ben do this on to it, then they'll ship it off to you.
You've written too many horror novels to offer to write signatures in blood. I think too many people would take you up on that. So, and we will have the email address and the website for Content Books in the credits if you stick around and hang out for the credits. And Andy.
I mean, the book will be out with Cambridge University Press sometime next year. I made sure to negotiate that it will be relatively well priced for an academic book, no more than $39, hopefully a little bit less. And I have a website, andybruno.net, with just some stuff about my research and other writings. So.
All right. Well, thank you guys both so much for being here tonight. This was an awesome conversation. Ben, of course, I love your book. It's great. I think everybody should read it. And Andy, I think when your book comes out, you need to do some kind of book tour with Ben, just talking about comets and craters all over town. I'd like to also thank Jeremy Benson for being here and giving us some terminology, and thanks again to NIU STEAM and to the NIU Friends of the Library and to the NIU Libraries themselves. And he couldn't be with us at the beginning, but thanks also to Dean Fred Barnhart, the Dean of the Libraries, who helps to make all of this possible. So have a great night. Thank you for exploring science and fiction with us here at Futuretelling. Our next event is October 27th, where we will have author Grady Hendrix talking about the haunted mind with some other experts. So have a great night, and thanks again, guys.
Thank you, Gillian.